Good afternoon, everyone, and warmly welcome to this webinar on the modern labor market research. My name is Daniel Lind, and I work as a research director at the trade union think tank Arenagruppen. And within Arenagruppen, I'm responsible for the so-called Produktivitetskommissionen, which is financed by the 5 unions within industry. Our main guest today is no less than David Card, professor at Berkeley, California, and the winner of last year's prize in economic sciences in the memory of Alfred Nobel. He got this prize together with his colleagues Guido Imbens and Joshua Angrist. And the prize motivation is short and spot on for his empirical contributions to labor economics. Mr. Card, we are very, very honored having you with us today. Thank you. With us today, we also have Niklas Blomqvist, who holds a PhD in economics and works as an economist at the Swedish Trade Union Confederation, LO. Welcome, Niklas.
Thank you.
The setup for today is very, very simple. First, there's a presentation by David Card, maybe around 35 minutes, focusing on the main themes of his prize-awarding research on labor markets. Second, Niklas will comment and pose some questions for Mr. Card. And hopefully, in the end, we can open up for questions from the viewers. So please state your questions on the internet, and we hopefully can address them later on. Okay, all in all, we have 60 minutes. Having said this, Mr. Card, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, today I'm going to give kind of an overview of some of the new research that's talking about firm wage setting in the labor market. I wouldn't say this research is exactly the research that I was awarded the Nobel Prize for. It's research that's coming out of research by a lot of economists in the last 20 years, and I'm going to try and give an overview of this work. And how that's changing the way, especially labor economists, look at some aspects of the labor market. So just to start off with, I think it's important to realize that the kind of standard textbook model that people use to study the labor market and is pretty much used by today working assumes that there's a kind of law of one price in the labor market. In other words, a given worker has a wage that they can obtain in job, and that wage is the same no matter what employer they work for. And the reasoning for that is that that wage is set by some kind of market force, and at any point in time, there's a market collection of people who would potentially bid for that worker, and they have, by some magic of Adam Smith type logic, there's a wage that's emerged for that worker. In the last decade, there's been a lot of interest in trying to break out of that model. Obviously, that's an oversimplified model, but I think people are, at least a lot of labor economists, are finally starting to realize that the oversimplification is perhaps too severe for many problems of great interest. And if you follow the labor economics literature, like the NBER or anything like that, you'll see there's a paper or two coming out every week now that's talking about firm wage setting power. So my goal today in this talk is to sort of give an overview of that, try and give a little bit of background and some of my reading of some of the evidence about it. And then I'll come back and talk a little bit. Daniel asked me to talk just briefly about minimum wage issues. I know that you have Aaron Dubé in this series coming up a few months from now, and Aaron is, of course, one of the leaders in that area, so I'm going to mostly leave that for him. I think it's helpful to think about 3 types of settings for wages. Wages are a little bit different than product prices in that there's often an institutional component, for instance, trade unions. A lot of research is these days thinking about US-style setting where there's effectively very little influence from unions except in a few small sectors or in the government sector. And so I'll mainly be focusing on that setting for the first part of the talk. There's a second setting that's pretty interesting. I've been working on for a couple of years now, and that's a setting where you have a sectoral bargains in the background, but those kind of set floors for wages. And I've been doing research for the last few years with Ana Cardozo in Portugal. In the Portuguese setting, which I'll talk about in some detail, most workers receive a top-up on top of the minimum for their occupation. That's quite different than the way unions work in the United States. In the United States and Canada, where I grew up, when a union sets a wage, that's the wage that you get paid. But in a lot of European settings, that's not what you get paid. That's the minimum that you can get paid. The third setting is this traditional US bargaining model where firms negotiate a set of firm-specific wages and each worker gets paid that scale. I did research on that setting for many years in the 1980s, but that setting is kind of, I think, a little bit less interesting, and there's not these days, and there's not much going on in that area. So I'm going to focus mostly on part A, this sort of no institutional component part, potentially with the exception of the minimum wage, and then I'll talk a little bit about the European setting in my work with Anna. So let's go into the background of this a little bit. Probably most people are aware that this word monopsony. It was invented by a Greek scholar who was a friend of Joan Robinson's, and I actually wrote him a letter in 1993, and he sent me back a very detailed discussion of how he came up with the word when Mrs. Robinson asked him to come up with the word. Anyway, it means basically a situation where a seller is the unique seller. The only seller or buyer, excuse me, the only buyer of a product. What it really means these days is the firm has an upward sloping supply of labor. So if it wants to hire more workers, it's going to have to pay a higher wage. Sort of the equivalent of a downward sloping product demand faced by a firm with some market power. And in this setting, what's important to keep in mind is that the marginal cost of an extra worker is not just their wage, but it's the wage that you're going to pay that extra worker, plus the fact that you're going to have to raise wages for all your other workers a little bit. And that introduces a concept that's called the marginal cost of labor, or the marginal factor cost. I was taught that phrase, MFC, and that's the phrase I'll use in a couple slides from now. And mathematically, the marginal cost of an extra worker, if you think of the wage bill as the product of the number of workers, N, and the wage that you have to pay to get N workers, WN. If W depends on N, then and you take the derivative of that function, you see that it turns out that the marginal cost of an extra worker is the wage times another factor. And this factor that blows up the wage is 1 + 1 over the elasticity of labor supply. So if the labor supply elasticity is like 100 or 1,000,000, then you can ignore it because it basically doesn't add to the wage. But if the labor supply elasticity is a number like 4, then you're adding about 25% on top of the wage, which means that if even with a fairly elastic supply of labor to the firm, a number like 4, it means that the cost to the firm of increasing labor and not hiring an extra worker is substantially above the wage. And that's the basic idea. And what Robinson noted in her book in 1933 was that if a firm has an upward sloping supply curve of labor, it's going to set the marginal product of workers, MP, I've called it on this slide, going to set that to their full marginal cost. So you're going to equate the wage to, if you equate the marginal factor cost to the wage times 1 + 1 over epsilon, it means that the wage is actually less than the marginal product. And the markdown of that difference is the ratio of the elasticity of supply to 1 + the elasticity of supply. Now, there's kind of an unfortunate terminology that people use to describe this. They called this the exploitation index. I think Pico invented that phrase, which makes it sound like something very inappropriate or possibly illegal. We don't think of it quite that way when we say that a firm charges more for its product than it costs to produce it. We call that a markup, and we don't have any kind of normative term for that. I think one problem that confronted Robinson right away was that people started to interpret her model normatively. So they started to think, well, this is really bad. We don't want to have markdowns. We don't want to have exploitation. But I don't think we want to think about it that way. We want to think about it as, if you think about a firm, if you're familiar with an owner of a small firm or even a larger firm, when they're thinking about how they should think of the cost of the worker, they're not going to hire workers all the way to the point where the last worker hired just pays for herself with their productivity. They're going to stop a little bit before that. And this tells you where they're going to stop. Now, one implication of monopsony models, a lot of monopsony models, is that a firm would like to hire an extra worker at any point in time. So any firm that has this wage setting power is in a situation where if some worker came along and was willing to work at the wage that everybody else was working at, then the firm would be willing to hire them, because that would be a situation where they could avoid having to raise wages for the other workers when they hire a new worker. And so there's settings where I think that is not particularly attractive, and that would be one setting where that seems a little inappropriate or not quite right, is when there's a fairly significant recession in the economy. And one of the reasons I think why monopsony really failed to get going in the 1930s was the middle of the Great Depression. So if you literally took the Robinsonian model seriously, it said, well, this is true, but actually firms would love to hire you. If you were just show up at the door and say, I'll work for the same wages all those other guys get. And so that seems a bit, there's something missing from that model. And that's a problem that needs to be confronted, and still not entirely confronted in the existing literature so far. So what people have been working on in the last few years in the area, sort of two different ideas about why is labor supply upward sloping. The old-fashioned idea, the one that motivated the word monopsony, is that the firm is the only buyer of labor. And so if you're as old, no, I'm sure none of you are as old as me, but people as old as me were taught about monopsony, and we were thinking about like a company town, so-called company town, where a town where there was only one, say a mining town, where there's one mining company in town, hires everybody. That, I think, is not really the right way to think about monopsony. There's two existing frameworks. One framework is an information framework motivated by search type models. Now, surprisingly, even though search models have been around since the 1970s, it took quite a long time. Really, the fundamental paper in this area was not published until 1998, which is in economics time, that's like last weekend. A paper by Ken Burdett and Dale Mortensen. Dale won the Nobel Prize in part for some of this related work some years ago. They showed that if firms are setting wages, taking account of all the other firms' wages, each firm is going to choose a position on, you could think of it as a wage ladder. Some firms are going to be at the bottom, some are going to be at the top. Firms at the bottom of the wage ladder, they have a benefit of paying a low wage, but they have a cost in that a lot of their workers are leaving constantly to go up the ladder. And these days in the labor economics literature, that phenomenon is called poaching. So there's a lot of evidence and it's starting to be very interesting studies of how poaching behavior works. You can see, and with administrative type data sets are now available, we can see very clearly workers moving from a lower wage firm to a slightly higher wage firm. And many, many of us with children would think of our children maybe starting in their careers early on with a job that's maybe not very far up the job ladder and then moving up a little further. Or in academia, I like to give the example of, somebody would be working at Berkeley, which is kind of a low wage employer. And then if you were lucky, you would get a call from Stanford, and that would be a higher wage employer. You would move up the job ladder. So it's a pretty pervasive phenomenon. And Mortensen and Burdett showed that strangely enough, that's an equilibrium. Like there are firms that are kind of equally happy to be at the bottom and the top of the ladder because there's a benefit of being at the bottom, which is that you pay low wage. There's a cost and that people are stealing all your workers, so you have to keep recruiting. But on average, kind of firms are indifferent where they are. And that's kind of an extreme model, but very interesting. An alternative model is the same kind of model that people use to model demand for complicated consumer products like cars or food or wine or products where there seem to be way, way many products and yet everybody buys something. And the way we think about it is that these are differentiated products. And you could think about probably there's an element of truth to this aspect of jobs as well. And so a few years ago, Pat Klein and I were working on a project, and we proposed this idea as a way to model the reason for upward sloping supply of workers. So if you only need a few workers, you can probably find somebody for whom your particular job is a good fit. You're nearby, or you've got hours that they want, or they happen to like working with you. But if you're going to expand a little bit, you're going to have to start getting workers who are, more and more opportunities available elsewhere for them. And so you're going to actually have to raise the wage as you increase the size of your firm, according to this kind of model. So those are the two main models that people are working with. So what's happened in the framework of this new kinds of monopsony models in the 1990s? My assessment is there's been 4 new types of evidence, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them today. One is there's quite a resounding bit of evidence on wage elasticities of quits and recruiting, showing very clearly, and this is motivated very much by that Mortensen-Burdett kind of model, showing very clearly that firms that pay higher wages have lower quit rates and recruit faster. There's a second body of work which is showing that more productive firms pay higher wages. And that's not too surprising to most people. If you just said that, that doesn't seem like a shock. But actually, that's not consistent with the textbook model. In the textbook model, a more productive firm shouldn't pay a higher wage than a less productive firm. Everybody should be paying the same wage for adjusting for the quality of the worker. A third strand of work that's pretty new and very interesting is studies of what happens when there's, say, a merger of 2 companies in the local labor market. What happens to wages? And this is very closely related to studies of what happens to product prices when 2 firms merge and suddenly the 2 competing products are now sold by one person. And that I'll mention that research. A fourth area, which I won't talk about today, there is quite a bit of interesting work on uncovering conspiracies about how firms have gotten together and conspired to lower wages. A very prominent example of that was engineers in the tech sector in Silicon Valley. For 20 years, there was an active conspiracy started by Steve Jobs, actually. So let's talk about quits and recruiting. Now, remarkably, the connection between quit and recruiting elasticities and the elasticity of labor supply was really unclear until Mortensen-Burdett's paper. And that it's really hard to understand why people were so confused about that. But it turns out that in a dynamic setting where you're constantly recruiting and constantly hiring new workers, which is the case for almost all employers, if you want to have a steady workforce of 100 workers, most employers are aware that they're going to have to hire 4 or 5 new people every year, sometimes 10 or 15. Or for some kinds of jobs, like warehouse jobs, big tech company like Amazon, they would have something like more than 100% turnover per year in many cases. So if you want to keep 100 workers in the factory, you might have to hire 200 people a year in a really high turnover sector. And it turns out in that setting that the elasticity of labor supply is really the sum of 2 elasticities. One is the elasticity of recruiting, and the other is the negative elasticity of quitting. And so if you pay a higher wage, you could potentially recruit faster. That's one benefit of higher wage. And that'll contribute to having more workers present. If you pay a higher wage, your workers are going to quit less, partially because of this job ladder effect. And that's a second component. And both of those add together to give you a total elasticity of labor supply. And Alan Manning, in a very important contribution in his famous book, Monopsony in Motion, really the first mid-2000s book to introduce all of the concepts of monopsony in a very clear way, noted that the 2 elasticities should be approximately equal in a lot of different models. And that's helpful because a lot of times you can estimate the quit elasticity, but you can't estimate the recruiting elasticity or vice versa. And so what people are often doing is using Manning's rule. There's a lot of new literature on this. I'm just going to mention a couple of papers in this area. One that I really like is a paper by a couple of my colleagues at Berkeley, Ernesto Dalbo, Fred Fanan, and Rossi, have a paper where they did a randomized control trial with the assistance of the civil service in Mexico. And they changed the wage that was being offered for the same job in different places. And they found that if they offered a higher wage, they got faster filling time. And they estimated that the elasticity was around 2. So that suggests that the total elasticity, if you sort of double that, according to Manning's rule, total elasticity is around 4. There's a meta-analysis paper. People are probably aware that this is a kind of a standard technique getting more and more used in economics, where you put together a rapidly growing literature and you say, well, what does it all show? And this Saklova and Sorensen paper in 2021 does a meta-analysis of all the studies of quits and recruiting and concludes that the elasticity is in the range of 4 to 6. Now, 4 to 6 is it's not infinite, but it's not 0. So it means that firms that pay a higher wage can expect to recruit more or have lower quits. And it means that the markdown of productivity is in the range of 20 to 25%. So a kind of a realistic number, I think. A second body of work is something that I've contributed to in some of my own work with Pat Klein and Jörg Heinig in IAB in Germany, and with Ana Cardoso working with data from Portugal, and more recently with some colleagues working with data from Brazil. We've looked at the relationship between the wages that firms offer and turnover and firm productivity. And in this paper that I mentioned a couple of slides ago, Pat and I, in combination with Jörg and Anna, wrote a simple model based on these preferences of different workers for different jobs. And the specification we used is a specification directly adapted from studies of consumer demand. And it's a so-called logit model. Not that that's particularly important, but it's analytically extremely convenient. And we showed that generates a job ladder model. It generates a model where higher productivity firms pay a wage premium relative to other firms, and magnitudes of the premiums and the relationship between the premiums and productivity that would be more or less consistent with standard thinking about those concepts. It does give a different interpretation of an old concept of rent sharing. There's a lot of literature in economics that suggested that higher wage firms pay higher wages, or higher productivity firms pay higher wages, excuse me. And sometimes people interpreted that as, firms were very nice and they were sharing some of the rents. This is a different model. It says firms that are more productive need a bigger workforce. And in order to do that, they're going to have to pay a higher wage. So it's nothing generous about the firms. One interesting thing about that model is, strictly speaking, although there's a job ladder, everybody prefers their current job because their preferences are what's driving their choice of what firm to work for. And with these idiosyncratic preferences, some people like a job even if it's got a little bit lower wage. Just like if you think about consumer products, some people like to buy less expensive wine and some people like to buy more expensive wine. They all get the job done if you're just trying to have a drink, but there are very obviously differences in tastes about who wants what. There is as I mentioned, this expanding literature on the number of competitors. Historically, people have been very uncertain about what that connection is, because you can have a small number of firms and be actively competing for workers, or you can have a large number of firms. In some of the extreme models, there's essentially an infinite number of firms, and yet competition is limited because of information frictions or idiosyncratic preferences. So you can't necessarily assume that the number of competitors is a very strong signal, but there's a lot of interesting research which is focusing on this question of number of, in part because it's something we can measure. And in a really interesting study, a paper by Azir et al. Took data on vacancy advertisements in one of the large conglomerating systems that basically takes all of the vacancy postings and puts them into a kind of a standardized list. And they concluded that for an amazing number of occupations, in a typical commute zone, which is a large labor market area in the United States, typically like the whole city of New York is one commuting zone. In a typical commuting zone and occupation, there's only a small number of employers that are actively recruiting at any point in time. In their analysis, it was only about equivalent to 2.5 firms recruiting at any point in time for a given occupation in a given commuting zone. So that suggests that there's actually a little bit less competition than people historically have thought about. Now, what I think that's an interesting descriptive fact, but what I think is really interesting is a bunch of recent studies which have tried to look for evidence that when there's a merger or acquisition, M&A activity, that something happens to wages. And I mentioned at the bottom of this slide 3 recent studies, one by Arnold, one by Ben-Malek et al., and one by Prager and Schmidt. And these 3 studies all look at what happens when there's a merger to, first of all, to the degree of concentration of hiring in different markets. And then secondly, to what happens to wages. And all 3 show that when you kind of put together a couple of firms that were previously actively competing for workers in the same market, that tends to lower wages. And Prager and Schmidt, I think, is probably the nicest example. They show that hospital consolidations lower wages, particularly of 2 very specific types of workers, nurses and pharmacy techs, who are pretty much constrained to work in the hospital sector. Okay, let me then, for about 10 minutes, talk just very briefly about another kind of wage setting situation. And that's what I call wage setting on top of sectoral bargains. And so this a paper that I published this year with Ana Cardozo, it's in the Journal of the European Economic Association, looks at the wage outcomes in Portugal, which are in a way similar to the situations in Italy, Spain, France, Austria, a couple of other countries, where there's essentially more or less complete coverage of sectoral bargains. But workers tend to get a wage above the sectoral floor in most situations. Now, I don't know to what extent that's the situation in for example, in Sweden, but I think some of the aspects of what we did would be relevant, particularly in the Nordic setting. So the way to think about this is that the wage you see for a given worker, which in this slide is called W, consists of 3 components. The wage floor, which is the minimum mandated by their sectoral agreement, plus the top up. We use the phrase of cushion for that component, H, plus some supplements. Now, supplements are more or less important in different countries. In Portugal and Brazil, actually, these are quite important. Everybody gets a 5-6 euros a day for lunch for some reason, basically because it's untaxed. And they get additional supplements for other causes. So if you put these components together, that gives the total cost to the employer, and that's what's kind of relevant for some purposes. In logarithms, you can do a decomposition, as I've shown here on the second slide, and we actually use the logarithmic version just because, you know, as a labor economist, we love everything to be proportional. So basically, it says that there's a floor plus the cushion is the log of the floor plus the cushion over the floor, which is roughly speaking the proportional cushion, and then the supplement component is just basically equivalent to the essentially component to the proportional supplement. And what we do in the paper is we show how those 3 components are distributed across workers and how they change at wage negotiations and how they responded to the crisis. And let me just show a couple of slides. This slide, apologize for the fact that it's vertical, is a distribution of relative wage floors. So this is how high is your sectoral wage floor above the minimum wage in Portugal. And you can see that that's got a spike at 0. So there's actually a surprising number of sectoral agreements in Portugal which don't pay any more than the minimum wage. And that's because, especially these days after the crisis, they didn't renegotiate the sectoral agreements. They froze them, and the minimum wage kept going up. And so the sectoral agreements were eaten up by the floors, is a phrase that they use in Portuguese. And that particularly influences women. The bottom graph is a histogram of the wage cushions. And there's also a spike in that at 0, but something like 75% of all workers get some kind of wage cushion. So it's important to keep in mind those 2 components. This shows the means of these components by education by year. So I'm showing the upper panel on the left is less than high school education. The bottom panel is university education. And you can already see some interesting things going on just from these simple descriptives. But the floor is the blue line, and the floor relative to the minimum wage is, for high school educated, less than high school, panel A, is only about 20%. So the typical less than high school educated worker in Portugal, which is a pretty big group, is only earning a wage floor that's only 20% above the minimum. But of course, if you go to the university educated, it's much higher than that, 65 log points. And you can see that over the course of the 2000s, that for the university educated workers in particular, there was a big drop there. The red line is the cushions. For high school educated workers, the typical cushion component is only about 10%. For the high school educated, it's around 20%. For the university educated, it used to be around 50%, but it fell to about 40%. And then the supplements are around 10 or 15%. So that's kind of the distributions of those components. What we show in our paper is 5 main conclusions. First, when sectoral floors are renegotiated, all the floors in a given contract move up by the same amount. So it's kind of mechanical, not too surprising, I think, for many institutional people that would be true. We show that the sectoral adjustments are pretty responsive to conditions in the industry. So what that means is that when the average firm that's covered by an agreement is doing poorly, the sectoral floor doesn't go up very much. When the average is pretty good, it goes up faster. And interestingly, we checked out a kind of old-fashioned theory that people had, that sometimes the sectoral agreements are too closely attuned to the very best firms in the industry. If you were a union negotiator, what you'd like to do is you'd like to peg wages to the best firm in the industry, try and raise them that way. But that doesn't seem to be what happens. It's much more closely related to the average. A third conclusion we reached is that when sectoral floors rise, only a share of that is passed through. So what happens is when you raise the wage floor that you have to pay, employers don't necessarily increase the wage that they pay their workers, which is the wage floor plus the wage cushion. They basically effectively are reducing the cushion. Cushion isn't a thing that is legally mandated or constrained. It's just an amount that you're paying the worker. And so on average, there's only about a 50% pass-through, which gives a source of flexibility for individual firms in the Portuguese type setting. The fourth thing we conclude, and we saw a little bit about in the previous slides, is that during the crisis, real wages fell through many different mechanisms. First of all, there was a reduction in the floors. Secondly, there was a reduction in these cushion components. And a third really important component was reallocation of workers to different categories. So between 2010 and 2018, near the end of our sample, you can see that the typical, especially younger worker, younger highly educated worker, used to be going into a sectoral agreement at maybe the third or fourth category, even at the beginning of their careers. And instead, many of them are moving to much lower categories. And the fifth thing we saw, and we saw a little bit of evidence of this, is that the minimum wage in Portugal was very important in supporting floors. Okay, and this is my last slide. I'm just going to comment briefly on the topic of minimum wages, because I know that's a topic that Daniel in particular was interested in. And let me just say that there's a huge amount of new work in this area, none of it by me. So I haven't done any work on minimum wages for quite some time. Some of it's by one of my PhD students, Attila Lindner, and some is by Aaron Dubé, who's going to be giving a talk. And they have written a bunch of papers together and some separately on a bunch of different aspects of minimum wages. And here's 3 of the papers that I think are really interesting, and hopefully you'll get a feel from these when Aaron talks. One is a new study of the effects of the German minimum wage. You remember, or I'm sure everyone here knows, Germany didn't have a minimum wage until relatively recently. And then just a little less than 10 years ago, introduced a national minimum wage at a fairly high level. And many German economists were predicting disaster, including some of my friends, by the way. That didn't happen. So this paper is by Christian Dussmann and Uta Schönberg and Attila Lindner. It's in the Quarterly Journal of Economics just this year, showing that actually employment effect of the minimum wage was close to 0. There was a big wage increase for lower wage workers, and there was some reallocation of employees across firms. So maybe consistent with the kind of job ladder models we were talking about, you see movements of people. The firms at the bottom of the job ladder basically closed down or went out of business, and lots of workers appear to have moved up the job ladder. Then there's 2 other studies I mentioned here. Both are by Aaron Dubé, Attila Lindner, and then some co-authors. One is in the QJE a couple of years ago. It's studying all the state minimum wage increases that have occurred. And this more recent one, the second of the 2, is in the Journal of Labor Economics 2022. That paper reanalyzes effects of minimum wages, but looks at a slightly different way of thinking about it. It says, well, when we raise the minimum wage, we don't exactly know who's going to be covered, but we have an idea that certain types of workers may be likely or predicted to be affected, and they try and see how far they can get with that. And so those are three of the most interesting studies. As I said, all three of these studies are basically finding net employment effects close to zero, positive wage effects, and some reallocation of workers in the German case. So I think that's a really interesting area, and integrating what people are finding with minimum wages with this other perspective on wage setting, I think is an agenda for future research. I'm going to stop there and take some questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Card. I leave the floor to Niklas now. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you, David Card, for an interesting presentation. So I first want to stress something that you already touched upon, and that is that it's important to remember that this monopsony term is an umbrella term for employer having market or wage setting powers over workers. So it's not only something that depends on labor market concentration, and you mentioned information costs. There's information asymmetries, search cost, worker preferences, of course, fewer vacancies than firms. I would like to add that also unemployed workers typically don't have a good economic possibility to, so to say, hold out for a better job when they are unemployed, which in the short run makes it more costly for a worker to turn down a match than it is for a firm. Adding to this, we can also say that if there are a weak aggregate demand in the economy, of course, there will be fewer vacancies, which will also give the employers an upper hand in wage negotiations. So I just wanted to reiterate this because I think it gives us an understanding of how the labor market works in general, and that this wage setting power over workers exists even in places like Stockholm and large cities where there are a great many employers to choose from, so that we can understand that this model, or this way of thinking about the labor market is something that we should think of for the whole labor market, not just some specific places. The other thing that I would like to bring up is that labor market that is characterized by monopsonies may affect more than just the wage. So we have some interesting, now I sadly don't remember the author of this paper, but there's an interesting paper recently published that shows that participation in election increases when you increase the minimum wage. So you can have effects on democracy and, of course, equality when we have a labor market that is characterized by monopolies. We can also think that we can have affect the productivity overall in society. So, for example, in recent years, we've seen that firms have started to accumulate large savings, and instead of using this for productivity enhancing investments, many companies stash profits within financial markets, which could contribute to lower growth and financial instabilities. So if we think about this as a market power for workers question, we can also see that if we would increase that market power for workers, firms would be pressured to use their revenues for pay increases and investments. The other way to look at it is to say that if wages are low, firms might find it beneficial to forego technologies and instead opt to pay very low wages to low productivity workers. It can have an effect on that aspect as well. So this means that what we heard here from Card is that we need to have a broader view and think about how different policies, for example, the minimum wage that was mentioned, work in the economy as a whole. So here the monopsony model is, of course, better than the competitive model because it can explain this empirical finding that if we increase the minimum wage, we don't necessarily have to affect employment negatively, although it could be the case depending on how much increase it, of course. However, some aspects might still get lost in these models. For example, if the potential productivity gains of increasing wages might get lost also in the monopsony model. And for sure, of course, the fact that it might increase political participation and have beneficial effect on society as a whole. And we can take it even further. This may feed back to labor force participation and employment in the long run in ways that we cannot measure. And I'm not saying that it's feasible or even something that we want to have in these theoretical models of the labor market, but I think that something could be interesting and important to have at the back of your mind when you think about these models and how the labor market works. I also want to highlight that monopoly of power that creates some problems for the functioning of how the labor market, but at the same time, it's a problem with many potential solutions. So, for example, if we would increase the minimum wage, that would actually lower the monopoly of power for employers. That could be said to be the American way. Another way to think about this is that we can have strong unions and union-friendly policies, and that would actually be beneficial for how the labor market works. Another thing that we could think about to actually make it better, the labor market work better, could be potentially to increase unemployment benefits in order to increase the holdout potential and bargaining power for workers. And overall, of course, if we have a better aggregate demand in the economy, that will increase the market power for workers. But I should also, I think, before I end, I think I should give a Swedish perspective on this issue. So the monopoly power is not a well-researched area on Swedish data. However, I think that one thing stands out when we look at Sweden compared to the US. So of course, it's not only a question about concentration, which David Card mentioned, but one thing that I think is interesting, and that something that my colleague Fredrik Söderqvist is working on, is a paper where in Sweden we can see some indication that for white-collar workers who have individual wage-setting schemes, concentration, that is having fewer firms, is detrimental for wages because they rely on having an outside options to work out this job ladder. But for blue-collar workers in Sweden, it might be more important to be able to threaten to go on strike than it is to be threatening to leave the firm in order to get a higher wage. Thus, organizing through unions and setting central wages through collective agreements may be more important than having an outside option in this case. So in Sweden, it may be the case that having many small firms might make it harder in some areas to organize and unionize the workplace, which might actually decrease wages for workers potentially. I have to add that this is all tentative results at this point, but I think it goes well with the idea that monopoly is not all about market concentration. It's also a question about bargaining power that arises from other settings as well, information costs, but also how the other side of the labor market works, not just employers, but also how workers are organized and how the wage setting schemes works. For example, as David Carr mentioned, how it works differently in Portugal than in the US. And of course, in Sweden, we have strong unions. This might have a positive effect on the labor market, maybe one reason why our employment rate is quite high. However, it also makes the trend of lower unionization rates, especially for low-wage workers that we see in Sweden, all the more worrying. So we have an increase in occupation with less stable employment, that is temporary contracts, and also an increase we have many smaller subcontractors instead of one large firm, which makes union organizing more difficult. And how this will affect bargaining power for labor is an important, difficult problem to solve and think about, I think. I would also like to say that taking all these earlier points together, this tells us that we need to have a broader view of how the economy and especially labor market works when thinking about not only minimum wages and how union works in this, but also when we think about that it's not only a question about who gets what share of the surplus when a firm and a worker match in a search model, because there are other things that affect each other. Market power for workers not necessarily detrimental to employment, but it's also beneficial for other parts of societies as well. And I also want to add that to this, that we could think that policies that would increase demand in the economy would have beneficial effects overall. The reason being that it puts workers in a better position and forces firms to invest. But in the end, I think that it's interesting to see that these things that David brought up is something that we actually have had some knowledge about since the 30s when John Robinson talked about this, but it's also something that's been in the knowledge for unions, of course. However, it's also something that research now again are realizing, just at the same time as we can see, for example, social democratic parties across Europe are being punished for having forgotten these same things about how the labor market works. Having said that, I was asked or told to ask some questions that I think that would be interesting for David to share his thoughts about. So one thing is how you think unions fit into this world of monopolies and how they should be considered in future research. A related question is how we should think about this thing about concentration amongst employers, if there are, in fact, it may in fact be the case that some firms may be more easy to unionize and increase bargaining power if they are more concentrated rather than less concentrated. And I also would like to hear what you think about other policies that we can think about. So when we think about labor market policies like unemployment benefits that I mentioned, and also active labor market policies and so forth, are those some policies that we should reevaluate now that we think about the labor market through the lens of monopoly power rather than through this competitive model? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
That was very, very good, very long and discussant. David, please, the three questions. How does union fit into this monopoly literature and the future research, do you think?
You know, I haven't given it. I think one thing I was trying to make clear in my presentation, I think, is that really depends on the kind of union setting you have. If you have the setting where the unions are setting sectoral agreements and most workers are getting paid more than that, then they are putting pressure at the lowest, you know, the set of workers that don't get much of a cushion, but they're not really affecting necessarily the higher wage workers who are receiving more than the minimum for their category. So in a continental European kind of setting with those kind of wage bargains, I think the unions are acting like a set of minimum wages, basically. And so, in fact, that's kind of the paradigm that we're using to analyze it in my paper with Anna, that the sectoral agreements are setting a large set of minimum wages, which might make a lot of sense. You're tuning the minimum wage differently for different sectors. Higher for higher skilled workers, lower for lower skilled workers. So in principle, I think that that's a way to offset some of the monopoly power that might occur, especially at the low end of the labor market. In the settings where unions are directly negotiating with workers, unions are directly negotiating with employers and setting a wage, like more of a old-fashioned, what I call the type C category, where you might have a model of a wage setting between the two parties. I'm not entirely sure that there's too much direct spillover from this new literature to that literature. That literature is somewhat well developed. We understand some features of it. And I think it incorporates some of the same ideas, but I don't think if you've got a situation where a union has a stable recognition, okay, it's not going to lose its recognition rights easily, then you've basically got a situation where you don't have to worry, I think, as much about monopsony type issues, because basically the sole buyer is being offset by the sole seller in some ways. You asked me a little bit about other policies. there's some interesting work going on and trying to understand how things like immigration work in a monopsonistic model. Obviously, what's going on with immigration is you're increasing flows or availability of workers in different categories. And it's pretty interesting to try and figure out what exactly that does, how that differs between a monopsony model and a competitive model. I think that Alan Manning has a new project on that I've seen recently. I'm not entirely sure that the story is completely worked out yet, but I think that's a direction where I can see a lot going on. One thing I think that's relevant to keep in mind, a lot of policies are policies for people. You mentioned, I think, Daniel, Niklas mentioned, workers who are unemployed obviously have less bargaining power and are particularly likely to be affected by monopsonistic power. And that's actually built directly into these job ladder models. So really low wage firms at the bottom of the job ladder basically get all their workers from the pool of unemployment because they can't poach from anybody else because they're low wage. And their flow of labor is coming directly from the unemployed pool. And so if you think about that's, I think one of the good insights of a job ladder perspective is when a firm is getting most of its employees from the unemployed pool, you can tell that it must be sort of at the bottom of the job ladder. And when we're thinking about unemployment benefits or changes in programs for low-wage workers, supplements for people that are working, in-work benefits, they call them in Britain, or earned income tax credit kind of policies, they call them in the United States. Those kind of policies affect that set of workers at the firms at the very bottom of the job ladder that are largely dealing with employees that are their alternative to that job is not another employer but unemployment. So I think a monopsonistic perspective, recognizing this heterogeneity in the labor market between different employers and where they are in the ladder, really is helpful for organizing our thinking about who exactly are we thinking about what firms are we thinking about when we change unemployment benefits? What firms are we thinking about when we introduce an in-work benefit program, for instance? And understanding how they react and how that changes their position in the labor market will be, I think, quite interesting. No one's sort of started to do that just yet, but I think that's going to be something that's on the agenda for PhD students and things in the next few years. You asked me, somebody asked me in the chat about what new directions I see going on in this area. And I think it's somewhat related to some of the points that Niklas was raising. How exactly do we fit unions into if you have a unionized setting, how do you fit that in? It's a little hard for, most of my work is in the United States or I do this working with Anna in Portugal, but in the United States, for instance, it's not really possible to study that question because we don't really have effective unions, hardly at all. And so there's not much we can say about it. That research is going to have to be done by people in countries with significant union presence. So I think that's an opportunity for them. There's interest in it, but I think it's going to have to be, it's going to have to be done by people who really know the setting that they're working in, not so much the U.S. workers who've been behind some of this work. And even in Britain, unions are pretty limited in their power these days. I think there's some unions, but not nearly. Those are the main comments I would have at this point.
Many thanks, Mr. Card. You have a question from Fredrik here also in the chat. Did you see that? Thinking about the labor market in terms of Nash bargaining models. Oh,
yeah. Well, as I mentioned, I think in my talk, in the 1980s, I wrote a number of papers on that. Yeah. So I obviously like those models. I think they make sense. They do give a way to organize analysis. And as I said, I think our understanding of those models was fairly good. One thing we didn't completely resolve was what happens if the bargaining extends over not just the wage, but over other things like in principle, you could bargain over the level of employment, or you could bargain over staffing ratios or things like that. And does that matter? And is that important? And that's really about where that literature kind of stopped in the North American context. People sort of got some place there, and it concluded probably most of the bargaining that was going on was only over wages. British people call that a right to manage model. But basically, it seemed like the model was trade union and firm were bargaining over the wage, but they were leaving the authority to how much employment to set to the employer. And in principle, that you could benefit from extending bargaining to other domains, but not clear exactly whether there'd be some costs of that. Very difficult for day-to-day management of the employer side. How many workers do you hire? What are their hours and things like that? Employers really don't like that, and there might be some very strong costs, kind of organizational costs or bureaucratic costs for unions to try and intervene on that very much. So possibly our understanding of that issue would be different 30 years later, now that we have a much better understanding of how important it is when you're modeling something to keep in mind that you can have an idea that might be good in paper, but it's going to be very difficult to implement if in a dynamic world with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of noise. So I think in principle, those old-fashioned national bargaining models are very interesting.
Thank you, Professor Card. I have a question for myself before we end up. We have 2-3 minutes left. And I would like to go back to your late colleague, Alan Kruger. He was working on non-monetary aspects of work, with subjective well-being, among other things. So how do you perceive how labor markets work when it comes to monetary and non-monetary issues of work?
I think that's a really important question. I think, for instance, in understanding things like the gender gap and why women are working at different firms than men, it's really important to try and think that through. Is that a choice that they're making because there's different things that they value about one job versus another, like flexibility? And I think the new work on gender differences in many areas of economics is really emphasizing the importance of understanding these things that are a little different than just the wage you see today, like career opportunities. Yeah. Do you need to take a job where you have to travel a lot in order to have career opportunities? If that's the case, that's going to probably disadvantage women relative to men, or long hours, things like that. So I think that's very important. I think some of these monopsonistic models are easy to build around that because they, in principle, allow the firm to have multiple things. They could set a wage and some other feature. An interesting paper I just saw recently about along these lines had to do with worker safety, using data from Brazil, where there's really detailed information on accidents that occur on each job. And they showed very strong differences between men and women in how they valued workplace safety. Yeah. And virtually all of the least safe jobs were occupied only by men. And women, as they move up the job ladder in their analysis, tended to move away from unsafe jobs and put a lot of value in that, with some offset in reduction in the amount of wages they could get. So some of the classic high wage industries like mining and some parts of construction for lower skilled workers, basically their argument was some of that is probably choice because of the safety issues involved. So I think that's a frontier for future work.
Oh, thank you. Just one last question. When you started this research, the reaction from the colleagues of you was not always that positive when it comes to, and when I read that, yeah, I can see that I believe that you think that the science of economics has moved forward, but are you satisfied with the place where economics is now, or do you see any future needed developments?
Well, there's a concept, an old-fashioned concept in some of these old-fashioned American religions of what they call backsliding, which is when you think you've made forward progress and you fall back. And, you could say, if you think about American politics right now, it seems like we've fallen back to the 1960s in terms of race relations, for instance. Yeah. So I think that, young researchers are always having to challenge the old researchers and come up with new ideas, but I'm always a little reluctant to declare victory, because I don't think people have a lot of vested interests in lots of different models. A lot of reasons why people like models have to do not just with their aesthetic beauty or their empirical relevance, but also how useful they are for a particular argument you're making.
Yeah.
And so I think we always have to keep that in mind.
Okay, many thanks. The time is running out, so hopefully we can continue to discuss these and similar issues in Sweden. And thank you, Mr. Card, for your presentation and your participation.
Yeah, best wishes with your series. Yeah, I hope Aaron does a good talk for you on minimum wages.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yep. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.